The sleek black Mercedes-AMG GT roared through the historic streets of Georgetown at 2 a.m., its engine echoing off the brick townhouses like thunder. Music pounded from the speakers, so loud that pedestrians 3 blocks away could feel the bass. Behind the wheel sat Derek Morrison, 23 years old, Ray-Ban sunglasses on despite the darkness, one hand on the wheel, the other holding his phone as he filmed himself for social media. "Another epic night in D.C., baby," he shouted into the camera, swerving slightly. "When your dad's an ambassador, every night is VIP." Derek had always lived in a bubble of absolute privilege. Private schools in Switzerland, summers in the Hamptons, a trust fund that generated more money in interest than most families earned in a year. His father, Ambassador Charles Morrison, was one of the most powerful diplomats in Washington, a man who negotiated with presidents and prime ministers, who had the direct line to the White House. And Derek wore that power like armor, believing it made him untouchable. That night, he was coming from an exclusive club in downtown D.C., where he'd spent $3,000 on bottles of champagne, bragged about his father's connections, and dismissed the concerns of friends who suggested he shouldn't drive. "I'm fine," he'd sneered. "Besides, cops don't pull over people like me." At exactly 2:17 a.m., Derek approached the intersection of Wisconsin Avenue and R Street. The traffic light glowed bright red, clearly visible. Security footage would later show he didn't even slow down. His speedometer read 67 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour residential zone. The Toyota Camry entering the intersection never had a chance. The impact was catastrophic. Metal crumpled, glass exploded into thousands of glittering shards, airbags detonated with the force of small bombs. The Camry spun violently, once, twice, before slamming sideways into a concrete lamppost with a sickening crunch. The entire driver's side collapsed inward. Inside that Camry was Harold Patterson, 72 years old. Harold wasn't just any elderly driver. He was a decorated Vietnam War veteran who had served 2 brutal tours in the infantry, earning a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. After the war, instead of retreating into bitterness, Harold had devoted his life to service. For the past 23 years, he volunteered at the Washington, Virginia Medical Center 4 days a week, sitting with younger veterans suffering from PTSD, helping them navigate the bureaucracy, listening to their stories with patient compassion. On weekends, he visited elementary schools in uniform, teaching children about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve something larger than yourself. He was a widower. His beloved wife Margaret had passed 5 years earlier from cancer. But Harold never let grief turn him bitter. His 3 daughters visited him regularly, and his 7 grandchildren adored him. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday, who fixed neighbors' broken fences without being asked, who always had butterscotch candies in his pocket for kids. That night, Harold was driving home from the hospital where he'd stayed late comforting a young Marine who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan. He was tired but content, humming an old Johnny Cash song, thinking about the pancake breakfast he'd promised his granddaughter for the next morning. He never saw Derek's Mercedes coming. When paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, they found Harold unconscious, his head bleeding profusely from where it had struck the doorframe. His breathing was shallow and labored. 3 ribs were broken, one dangerously close to puncturing his lung. His pelvis was fractured in 2 places. His left arm was shattered. Blood soaked his Vietnam veteran's cap, which had fallen onto the passenger seat. The paramedics worked frantically, carefully extracting him from the wreckage while calling ahead to Georgetown University Hospital's trauma center. "We've got a critical patient, elderly male, massive internal injuries, possible brain trauma. 88 minutes. And Derek?" 20 feet away, Derek stood beside his Mercedes, which had only minor front-end damage. His airbag had deployed, giving him nothing worse than a small bruise on his chest. He was completely unhurt and completely unconcerned. Officer Jennifer Martinez was first on scene. A 12-year veteran of the D.C. Metropolitan Police, she'd seen countless accidents, but what she witnessed that night would haunt her for years. Derek was on his phone, texting. "Sir!" Officer Martinez shouted, running toward him. "Sir, are you injured? Were you driving this vehicle?" Derek looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Yeah, I was driving. And no, I'm fine. The old guy came out of nowhere. He ran the light." "Sir, you ran the red light. We have witnesses and—" "Do you know who my father is?" Derek interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ambassador Charles Morrison. I suggest you think very carefully before you continue this conversation." Officer Martinez felt her blood run cold, not from fear, but from rage. She'd seen entitled people before, but this was something else entirely. A young couple who'd been walking their dog had witnessed everything. They rushed over, the woman crying. "Officer, he ran the red light. We saw everything. He was going so fast, and he didn't even try to stop." "Did you check on the other driver?" Officer Martinez asked Derek directly. Derek shrugged. "Why would I? That's what paramedics are for." "Sir, I need you to take a breathalyzer test." Derek actually laughed. "I don't think so, officer. I'm invoking diplomatic immunity. My father is a sitting ambassador, which means I'm protected under the Vienna Convention. You have no jurisdiction over me. That's not how diplomatic immunity works." "Call my lawyer," Derek said, turning away dismissively. "Actually, don't bother. I already did. He'll be here in 10 minutes, and then you'll be apologizing. Maybe looking for a new job." Officer Martinez had to physically restrain herself. She watched as Derek pulled out his phone again and took a selfie, smirking, with the wreckage in the background. He posted it to Instagram with the caption, "Crazy night. Thank God for German engineering. Hashtag Mercedes saves hashtag blessed." The security camera at the corner store captured everything. The footage was damning. Derek's car racing through the red light, the horrific collision, Derek casually checking his phone while Harold was being cut from the wreckage, Derek actually laughing while talking to someone on the phone, pointing at the accident scene like it was entertainment. Within hours, that footage was everywhere. Local news stations led with it. Ambassador's son in hit and run. Victim fighting for life. The story spread like wildfire. Harold's photo appeared on every screen. His kind, weathered face, his uniform from a 4th of July parade, his grandchildren hugging him, his medals displayed in a shadow box. Social media exploded. Hashtag Justice for Harold trended nationally within 12 hours. People posted photos of Harold at the VA hospital, testimonials from veterans he'd helped, stories from children whose lives he'd touched. The contrast with Derek's Instagram feed, private jets, luxury cars, champagne bottles, arrogant captions about being above the rules, created a firestorm of rage. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs, "No one is above the law. Veterans deserve justice. Diplomatic immunity isn't a license to kill." The Washington Post ran a front-page story, "When Privilege Meets Justice, the Case That's Dividing D.C." Derek's legal team, 4 attorneys from Whitman and Hayes, the most expensive law firm in Washington, immediately went to work. They filed motion after motion. Dismissal based on diplomatic immunity, jurisdictional challenges, questioning the validity of the security footage, challenging the witness statements. They argued that as the son of a sitting ambassador, Derek was entitled to the same protections as his father under international law. For 3 agonizing weeks, it looked like they might succeed. Harold remained in the ICU, slowly improving but still in critical condition. His daughters held vigil, taking shifts, praying. The entire veteran community rallied around him. But the legal machinery seemed designed to protect people like Derek. Until Judge Margaret Holloway, known throughout D.C. as the Iron Lady of Justice, reviewed the case and scheduled an emergency hearing. She had a reputation, 32 years on the bench, never overturned on appeal, zero tolerance for privilege or corruption. She'd sent congressmen to prison, dismissed cases against homeless defendants when prosecutors overreached, and once held a billionaire CEO in contempt for showing up late to court. When her name appeared on the docket, Derek's lawyers went pale. The hearing was set for Thursday, 10 a.m. Georgetown would never forget what happened in that courtroom. But a shocking revelation was about to change everything, and no one, not even Derek's high-powered attorneys, saw it coming. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Washington weather that matched the city's mood. By 7 a.m., more than 200 people had gathered outside the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse, the crowd swelling with veterans in uniform, Harold's family members, concerned citizens, and reporters from every major outlet in the country. Inside, Courtroom 12 was packed beyond capacity. Every wooden bench filled, people standing along the back wall, reporters squeezed shoulder to shoulder in the designated press section. The air conditioning couldn't keep up with the body heat. The room felt suffocating, tense, electric with anticipation. Harold Patterson sat in the front row in a wheelchair, still pale and weak but determined to be present. His daughter Sarah sat beside him, one hand gently resting on his shoulder. The left side of Harold's face still bore deep purple and yellow bruises. His left arm was in a cast, his ribs wrapped tightly beneath his shirt. Every breath caused him pain, but his eyes, those were clear and focused. Behind them sat dozens of veterans, many in uniform, their faces solemn and angry. They'd come to support one of their own, to bear witness to whether justice still existed in America. At exactly 9:58 a.m., the bailiff, a former Marine named Rodriguez who knew Harold from the VA hospital, stood ramrod straight and called out, "All rise!" The Honorable Judge Margaret Holloway presiding. Every person stood. The rustle of movement filled the room, then sudden, complete silence. Judge Holloway entered from her chambers. She was 63 years old, her steel-gray hair pulled back in an immaculate bun, not a strand out of place. She wore her black robe with the authority of someone who'd earned every bit of respect her position commanded. Her face was angular, intelligent, her brown eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She'd been a prosecutor for 15 years before being appointed to the bench, and she'd seen every trick, every manipulation, every entitled defendant who thought the rules didn't apply to them. She took her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and surveyed the courtroom with a gaze that made several people shift uncomfortably. "Be seated," she said, her voice firm and controlled. Everyone sat. The tension was palpable. At 10:03 a.m., the side door opened, and Derek Morrison entered with his legal team. The reaction was immediate. A low murmur of anger rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway's gavel came down once, sharp and loud. Order. Instant silence. Derek walked in like he was arriving at a yacht club, not a courtroom where he faced serious criminal charges. He wore a custom-tailored Navy Tom Ford suit that probably cost $6,000, a crisp white Hermes shirt, Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. His hair was perfectly styled, still slicked back with expensive product. He moved with the languid confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for anything. His legal team surrounded him like a protective detail, 4 attorneys from Whitman and Hayes, each carrying leather briefcases, each radiating Ivy League arrogance. Derek didn't look at Harold. Didn't even glance in his direction. He took his seat at the defense table, crossed his legs casually, and whispered something to his lead attorney, Marcus Whitman himself, a legendary defense lawyer who charged $1,500 per hour and had gotten 3 senators acquitted on corruption charges. Judge Holloway watched all of this without expression, making notes. "This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of the People versus Derek James Morrison," she began, her voice carrying perfectly through the courtroom. "Mr. Morrison, you are charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Specifically, your vehicle, reckless endangerment, driving under the influence, and fleeing the scene of an accident resulting in serious bodily harm. How do you plead?" Marcus Whitman stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. Furthermore, We move to dismiss this entire proceeding on the grounds that Mr. Morrison is protected by diplomatic immunity as the dependent son of Ambassador Charles Morrison, whose official status. "I've read your motion, Mr. Whitman," Judge Holloway interrupted, not looking up from her notes. "And I've read the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations more times than you've probably been in a courtroom. Diplomatic immunity does not automatically extend to adult family members, particularly not for criminal acts committed off embassy grounds that have nothing to do with official diplomatic functions." "Your Honor, precedent clearly establishes." "Precedent also establishes that immunity can be waived, and that host countries have the right to prosecute serious crimes. We'll address your motion in due course. Right now, I want to hear from your client." She looked directly at Derek. "Mr. Morrison, please stand." Derek sighed, actually sighed, like this was all terribly inconvenient. He stood slowly, one hand in his pocket, the picture of casual arrogance. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Holloway said, her voice taking on an edge, "do you understand the severity of the charges against you?" Derek glanced at his attorney, who nodded slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't believe these charges have any real merit. This was an unfortunate accident. Traffic accidents happen every day." "This was not an accident," Judge Holloway interrupted. "You ran a red light at 67 miles per hour in a residential zone at 2 in the morning." "That's disputed," Derek said with a slight smirk. "It's on video, Mr. Morrison, from 3 different angles, including your own dashcam, which your phone was connected to." Derek's smirk faded slightly, but he recovered. Cameras can malfunction. Angles can be deceiving. The reality is that the other driver— he waved his hand dismissively in Harold's general direction without looking at him— the other driver should have been more cautious. Elderly drivers often have slower reaction times. The courtroom erupted. Veterans shouted in outrage. Sarah Patterson stood up, tears streaming down her face. Even some of the reporters gasped audibly. Judge Holloway's gavel cracked down 3 times. "Order! Order in this court!" The noise subsided, but the anger remained, thick in the air. Derek seemed genuinely confused by the reaction, looking around like everyone else was being unreasonable. Judge Holloway leaned forward, her eyes locked on Derek. "Mr. Morrison, you just blamed a decorated war veteran, a man who served 2 tours in Vietnam, a man who has spent decades helping others. You just blamed him for your decision to drive recklessly through a red light at dangerous speeds?" Derek shrugged. "I'm just stating facts, Your Honor. Older people shouldn't be driving at night if they can't handle." "Stop talking," Judge Holloway said, her voice like ice. "Right now." Derek's mouth snapped shut, but his expression remained defiant. The judge took a slow breath, visibly controlling her anger. "Mr. Patterson, would you like to address the court?" Sarah helped Harold stand. It took effort. He was still badly injured, still in considerable pain. But he rose with dignity, leaning on his daughter for support. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Harold's voice was weak but steady, each word clearly costing him effort. "Your Honor, thank you. I didn't want to come here today. My doctors told me to rest. But I needed to be here because—" He paused, catching his breath, pain flickering across his face. "Because I've served this country. I've seen friends die for it. I've fought in jungles and watched young men, boys, really, make the ultimate sacrifice for freedom and justice." He looked directly at Derek for the first time. Derek wouldn't meet his eyes. "I've never asked for special treatment," Harold continued. "Never wanted recognition. I just wanted to live a quiet life helping others, being there for my family. But that night—" His voice cracked. "That night, lying on the pavement, bleeding, unable to move, I watched that young man," he pointed at Derek. "I watched him laugh. I watched him take a selfie. I watched him make phone calls while I thought I was dying." Several people in the courtroom were openly crying now. "I don't want revenge, Your Honor," Harold said. "But I want him to understand that actions have consequences. That privilege doesn't put you above the law. That a human life, my life, anyone's life, has value, regardless of who your father is." He sat back down, exhausted, his daughter holding him. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Judge Holloway's expression had changed. Her jaw was set, her eyes hard. She looked at Derek, who was now staring at his shoes, his arrogance finally cracking just slightly. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "your privilege has clearly protected you from reality your entire life. You've never had to face consequences, never had to understand that other people's lives matter as much as yours, never learned basic human decency or empathy." Derek's lead attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client's character is not on trial here." "Sit down, Mr. Whitman," Judge Holloway said without looking at him. "I'm not finished." The attorney sat. "Mr. Morrison, you are about to learn something your father should have taught you years ago. You are about to learn what accountability means." Derek finally looked up, and for the first time there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. Judge Holloway was about to continue when there was movement in the back of the courtroom. A tall figure stood up from the very last row, where he'd been partially hidden behind a marble pillar. Every head turned. And then someone recognized him, and a shocked whisper spread through the room like wildfire. The man who stood in the back of the courtroom was unmistakable, even to those who'd never met him in person. His face had been on the cover of Time magazine 3 times. He'd negotiated the Middle East peace accords 2 years ago, had advised the last 3 presidents on foreign policy, and was considered one of the most brilliant diplomatic minds of his generation. Ambassador Charles Morrison. He was 58 years old, tall and distinguished, with graying temples and the kind of bearing that came from decades of walking into rooms where his words could literally change the course of history. He wore a charcoal suit, conservative, perfectly tailored, nothing flashy. His face looked exhausted, with deep lines that seemed to have appeared recently, etched by stress and grief. He'd been sitting there the entire hearing, in the shadows, unnoticed. "Your Honor," he said, his voice resonating through the courtroom with natural authority, "may I approach the bench?" Judge Holloway studied him for a long moment. She'd known he might appear, had even half expected it. But seeing him there, the weight of his presence, changed the entire dynamic of the room. "Ambassador Morrison," she said carefully, "I wondered if you would come." "May I speak, Your Honor?" She nodded slowly. "Approach." Charles Morrison walked down the center aisle. His footsteps were the only sound in the packed courtroom. Every eye followed him. Reporters' pens froze mid-word. Veterans straightened in their seats. Derek's face had gone white. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The ambassador didn't look at him. "Not yet." He reached the front of the courtroom and stood before Judge Holloway, his hands clasped in front of him, his shoulders squared but his head slightly bowed, the posture of a man carrying enormous weight. "Your Honor," he began, and his voice was different now, not the commanding diplomat's voice, but something rawer, more human. "I've served this country for 33 years. I've represented our nation in war zones and peace negotiations. I've sat across from dictators and terrorists and tried to find common ground. I've missed birthdays and anniversaries and my children's school plays because I was in some foreign capital trying to make the world a little safer, a little better." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I've always believed in honor, in duty, in the rule of law, in the idea that America stands for something, that we're a nation where everyone, regardless of power or wealth or position, is accountable." He finally turned to look at Derek, who sat frozen, tears beginning to stream down his face. "But I failed," Charles said, his voice breaking. "I failed as a father. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. "I gave my son everything," the ambassador continued. "The best schools, the finest opportunities, connections that most people couldn't dream of. But I never gave him the most important thing. I never gave him boundaries. I never taught him consequences. Every time he made a mistake, I fixed it. Every time he got in trouble, I made phone calls. Every time he needed to learn a hard lesson, I cushioned the blow." He wiped his eyes, not bothering to hide his tears. "I told myself I was protecting him, loving him. But what I was really doing was raising someone who thought he was above the rules, above decency, above basic human empathy." Derek was sobbing now, his head in his hands. "Your Honor," Charles said, turning back to the judge, "I did not come here today to use my position to protect my son. I came to tell you, to tell this court, to tell Mr. Patterson and his family, that I support whatever sentence you see fit to impose. My son nearly killed a man. A hero. A man who served this country with honor while I sat in air-conditioned embassy offices negotiating treaties." He looked at Harold, who sat motionless, tears running down his weathered face. "Mr. Patterson," the ambassador said, his voice thick with emotion, "I cannot express how deeply, profoundly sorry I am. You deserved so much better. You deserved to be safe on those streets. You deserved respect. You deserved justice. And you deserve it now." Harold nodded slowly, unable to speak. Marcus Whitman jumped to his feet, panicked. "Ambassador Morrison, sir, you don't have to say any of this. These statements could be used." "I know exactly what I'm doing, Mr. Whitman," Charles interrupted, his voice hardening. "And if you or anyone from your firm continues to use my name, my position, or my influence to shield my son from the consequences of his actions, you're fired. All of you. Effective immediately." The legal team sat down, stunned into silence. Derek looked up at his father, his face destroyed by grief and disbelief. "Dad, please." "No, Derek," Charles said, finally addressing his son directly. He walked over to the defense table and looked down at the young man who carried his name. "I love you more than you can possibly understand. You are my son, and that will never change. But love doesn't mean protecting you from the truth. Love means wanting you to become the man you're capable of being. And the man you are right now, arrogant, entitled, cruel, that's not who I raised you to be. That's who I allowed you to become by never saying no." Derek reached for his father's hand, but Charles stepped back. "You're going to face the full weight of the law," Charles said. "You're going to accept responsibility. You're going to feel consequences for the first time in your life. And it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever experienced. But if there's any hope for your soul, for your future, it starts right here, right now." The ambassador turned to Judge Holloway. "Your Honor, my son needs justice, not protection. Please give him what he needs, not what I want." Judge Holloway's eyes were wet, but her voice remained steady. "Ambassador Morrison, what you've done here today, the courage it took to stand against your own instinct to protect your child, to stand for principle instead of privilege, that's one of the most extraordinary things I've witnessed in 32 years on this bench." She looked at Derek, who had collapsed completely, his arms on the table, his body shaking with sobs. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked like what he really was, a broken, terrified young man who'd finally hit a wall his privilege couldn't break through. The protective bubble that had surrounded Derek Morrison his entire life had finally, irrevocably burst. Judge Holloway straightened her papers, her expression settling into the firm resolve of someone about to deliver judgment. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "stand up." Derek struggled to his feet, barely able to stand, his lawyer supporting him. "You're about to learn what true accountability means." Judge Margaret Holloway removed her reading glasses and set them deliberately on the bench. She'd been preparing this moment in her mind for days, balancing justice and redemption, punishment and the possibility of transformation. She looked at Derek Morrison, still crying, still trembling, finally vulnerable, and then at Harold Patterson, who sat with quiet dignity, and then at Ambassador Morrison, who stood with his head bowed. "Derek James Morrison," she began, her voice formal and clear, "you have pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against you is overwhelming and irrefutable. Security camera footage, witness testimony, forensic analysis of the accident scene, and your own vehicle's data recorder all confirm the same facts. You drove recklessly at dangerous speeds through a residential area, you ran a red light, you struck another vehicle with devastating force, and you showed no concern for the victim." She paused, letting the words settle. "More disturbing than the crime itself is your complete lack of remorse. Your arrogance. Your belief that your father's position placed you above the law and above basic human decency." Derek's attorney started to object, but Judge Holloway raised her hand. "I'm not finished. Mr. Morrison, you need to understand something fundamental. In this courtroom, your father's position means nothing. Your wealth means nothing. Your connections mean nothing. Here, you are simply a young man who made catastrophic choices and nearly killed an innocent person. And here, you will face consequences." The entire courtroom held its breath. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison," Judge Holloway declared. Gasps filled the room. Derek's legs buckled. His attorney caught him. "You will serve this sentence at a standard federal correctional facility, not a minimum security white-collar facility. You will be treated exactly like every other inmate. No special accommodations." Derek was sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. "The charges include aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, your vehicle, which carries a mandatory minimum of 3 years, reckless endangerment, fleeing the scene of an accident with serious bodily injury, and driving under the influence, which your blood test, taken at the hospital, confirmed showed a blood alcohol content of 0.12, well above the legal limit." She looked at Marcus Whitman. "As for diplomatic immunity, Mr. Whitman, the State Department has formally confirmed that such immunity does not apply to Mr. Morrison for criminal acts unrelated to diplomatic functions. Your motion is denied." Judge Holloway continued, "Upon your release, Mr. Morrison, you will complete 3,000 hours of mandatory community service. Not at some comfortable nonprofit your father's friends run, but at veterans' hospitals, VA rehabilitation centers, and facilities serving those who have actually sacrificed for this country." Harold Patterson sat straighter, nodding slightly. "You will spend every Saturday for 3 years at the Washington, Virginia Medical Center. You will help veterans with physical therapy. You will listen to their stories. You will push wheelchairs, clean bedpans, do whatever unglamorous work needs doing. You will learn what service actually means." Judge Holloway's voice intensified. "Additionally, you will write a personal letter of apology to every family affected by drunk or reckless driving in this district over the past 10 years. That's approximately 247 families. You will research each case, learn each victim's name, understand what was lost, and write, by hand, a genuine letter acknowledging their pain." Derek's entire body was shaking. "You will also attend mandatory counseling, twice a week for 2 years, focused specifically on empathy, accountability, and understanding privilege. You will complete courses on ethics, civic responsibility, and restorative justice. And you will maintain employment at minimum wage for at least 1 year after your release, so you understand what it means to work for what you have." She paused, looking at Harold. "Mr. Patterson, would you like to address the defendant before I conclude?" Sarah helped her father stand once more. Harold looked at Derek for a long moment, his weathered face showing both pain and something else, something that looked almost like compassion. "Son," Harold said quietly, "I've thought a lot about what I wanted to say to you. I was angry. God knows I was angry. I'm still recovering from injuries that will probably affect me for the rest of my life. Some days the pain is so bad I can't sleep." Derek looked up, his face destroyed. "But I've also thought about who you could become," Harold continued. "See, I don't think you're evil. I think you're lost. I think you've lived your whole life without anyone teaching you that other people matter, that their lives have value. That respect isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn." He took a shaky breath. "I forgive you, Derek. Not because you deserve it right now, but because I refuse to let bitterness poison what life I have left. But forgiveness doesn't mean there aren't consequences. Forgiveness doesn't erase what you did." Tears streamed down Derek's face. "I hope prison changes you," Harold said. "I hope you come out the other side as someone who understands sacrifice, who values human life, who treats people with dignity regardless of who their parents are. I hope you become the man your father wanted you to be. And if you do, if you genuinely change, then maybe something good can come from this tragedy." He sat down, exhausted but peaceful. Ambassador Charles Morrison approached his son. Derek looked up at him with desperate, pleading eyes. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Derek whispered. "I'm so sorry." Charles placed his hand on Derek's shoulder. "I know you are, and I believe you can become better than this. But you have to walk this path alone. I won't be visiting you in prison, not for the first 18 months. You need to face this without me trying to make it easier." "Dad, please. I love you, son. I will always love you. But you need to find out who Derek Morrison is when Ambassador Morrison's son isn't there to rescue him. When you're released, we'll rebuild our relationship. As equals. As two men who both made mistakes and learned from them." Derek hugged his father desperately, both men crying. Security officers approached. It was time. As they led Derek away in handcuffs, he looked back at Harold one more time. "Mr. Patterson," he said, his voice broken, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Harold simply nodded. The courtroom slowly emptied, people processing what they'd witnessed. Several veterans approached Harold, shaking his hand, thanking him for his grace. Reporters crowded outside, but for once they seemed subdued, thoughtful. Ambassador Morrison stood alone by the window, looking out at the Washington Monument in the distance, tears still wet on his face. 18 months later. The Washington, Virginia Medical Center's rehabilitation wing buzzed with activity on a Thursday afternoon. Physical therapists worked with patients, nurses checked vitals, volunteers moved between rooms offering support and companionship. In the main therapy room, a young man in simple gray scrubs was helping an elderly veteran named Thomas with his arm exercises. The young man was thin now. He'd lost probably 30 pounds. His hair cut short and simple, his face different somehow. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something quieter, humbler. "That's great, Mr. Thomas," he said encouragingly. 5 more reps and we're done for today." "You're getting good at this, Derek," Thomas said, grunting through the exercise. "Might have missed your calling." Derek Morrison smiled, a genuine smile, nothing like the entitled smirk from before. "Just trying to help, sir." He'd been released 3 weeks ago after serving 16 months, earning early release for exemplary behavior and completing multiple rehabilitation programs. The transformation had been brutal. Prison had stripped away every bit of his privilege, every assumption, every defense mechanism. He'd been beaten up his second week by inmates who knew who he was and hated what he represented. He'd cleaned toilets, worked in the kitchen, spent months in the prison library reading philosophy, history, and stories of redemption. He'd written all 247 letters, each one by hand, each one researched and genuine. Many families wrote back. Some with anger, some with forgiveness, some just acknowledging that he'd tried. And every Saturday for the past 3 months, Derek had been here, at the VA hospital, exactly as the judge ordered. Harold Patterson visited every Thursday. At 3 p.m., Derek saw him being wheeled in by his daughter Sarah. Harold had recovered significantly. He could walk short distances now, though he still tired easily. His smile, though, was as warm as ever. "Harold," Derek called out, walking over. "Good to see you, sir." "Good to see you too, son. How was your week?" They'd developed an unlikely friendship. At first, it had been awkward, painful, both of them navigating the terrible history between them. But slowly, through hours of conversation, through Derek listening to Harold's stories about Vietnam and service and loss, through Harold watching Derek genuinely change, something had shifted. "It was good," Derek said. "Started my GED classes at the community college. Working part-time at the hardware store downtown." "Minimum wage, right?" Harold asked with a knowing smile. $15.75 an hour, Derek confirmed. "And it's hard work, but honest work. I'm learning a lot." They talked for 20 minutes, about Derek's therapy sessions, about his plans to eventually study social work, about his relationship with his father, which was slowly rebuilding. Ambassador Morrison had kept his word. No visits for 18 months. But he'd written letters, long, honest letters about his own failures and hopes. Derek had read them hundreds of times. 3 weeks ago, they'd had dinner together for the first time. It was awkward, emotional, but real. They were learning to be father and son in a completely new way. As Derek finished his shift and headed for the exit, he passed the memorial wall, photos of veterans who died, their stories, their sacrifices. He stopped, as he always did, and looked at them. He thought about who he used to be, the arrogant kid who thought his father's name made him special, who'd valued nothing, respected no one, understood nothing about real life. That person felt like a stranger now. "Heading out?" a voice said. Derek turned. It was Harold, walking slowly without his wheelchair, using just a cane. "Yeah, finished for the day." "You okay, sir?" "More than okay," Harold said, joining him by the memorial wall. "You know, Derek, I thought a lot about whether I could ever forgive you. Whether you deserved a second chance." Derek's throat tightened. "I don't know if I do, sir." "Maybe none of us deserve second chances," Harold said quietly. "Maybe that's what makes them so powerful. They're not earned, they're given. But what you do with them, that's what matters." They stood together in silence for a moment. "You're not that kid anymore," Harold said. "I see it. Your father sees it. The question is, do you see it?" Derek looked at his reflection in the memorial wall's glass. "I'm trying to, sir. Every day I'm trying." Outside, Ambassador Charles Morrison was waiting by his car, not a diplomatic vehicle, just a regular sedan. When Derek emerged, father and son looked at each other. "Ready?" Charles asked. "Yeah, Dad. I'm ready." They drove through D.C. together as the sun set, painting the monuments gold. Derek looked out at the city. His city, the place where he'd hit rock bottom and somehow, impossibly, found a path back up. At a stoplight, Derek noticed a young veteran in a wheelchair waiting to cross. Without thinking, Derek jumped out of the car and helped him navigate the curb, making sure he got across safely. The veteran thanked him. Derek nodded, got back in the car. Charles was watching with quiet pride. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Derek said. "But I wanted to." And in that simple moment, everything had changed.